Welcome all of you friends to the World Chess Championship D Gukesh. Why did choose King Indian attack? What is the special in this opening variation? So stay with us. We will tell you about all the variation of this opening. So let's start now.
Directly occupying the center with d4 or e4 are White's most popular ways to open the game. But another important resource is to play the flexible knight f3, supporting the center and remaining flexible with the pawn structure. We're going to examine two interesting ways for White to continue after the classical response d5, claiming central space while inviting White to return to the classical queen-pawn openings by playing d4. If White would prefer to avoid mainline territory, the ready and King's Indian attack are two openings that generally emphasize positional understanding when concrete memorization is typically less important. Both of these openings share a kingside fianchetto. The ready typically involves striking against Black's center with c4. In the King's Indian attack, after first playing d3, prepares to challenge Black's center with e4. Instead of committing the central pawn structure, the King's Indian attack focuses on completing kingside development by fianchettoing the light-squared bishop, followed by castling kingside. We see this approach in action after the typical moves g3, knight f6, and bishop g2. Although White's play may be rather automatic in the early stages of the King's Indian attack, Black has a wide variety of options. We'll initially look at Black's approach of developing solidly and preparing rapid kingside development, starting with e6, supporting the center while preparing to activate the dark-squared bishop, although this approach does restrict Black's light-squared bishop. White completes the initial plan by castling kingside. White has built a solid home for the castled king, remaining flexible with the central structure. In its most basic form, King's Indian attack players are usually prepared to play d3, knight b to d2, followed by preparing the central strike e4. Although White may have a clear plan, it's important not to play these moves automatically. If Black tries to activate the dark-squared bishop with a move such as bishop c5, rather than mechanically continuing with d3, this is a good moment for White to play d4, grabbing central space while gaining an important tempo against Black's misplaced bishop. A more cautious, as well as solid approach is to develop the bishop to the modest e7 square, preparing kingside castling. Since White hasn't committed the central structure, there are still options to transpose into other openings. c4 is in the style of the ready, the other related opening we'll introduce later in the video. White may also decide to play d4, and if Black decides to castle, this can transpose into the popular Catalan opening after c4. If White wants to play the King's Indian attack, then the battle lines will be drawn after d3. You may wonder why this is called the King's Indian attack. White hasn't developed a single piece or pawn beyond the third rank. Although the opening starts out in a slow-paced manner, its dynamic potential should not be underestimated. After Black castles, White wants to strike in the center with e4, so this important pawn break is prepared with knight b to d2. Unlike moving the knight to c3 when it may be harassed by the d-pawn, the knight on d2 safely prepares e4. Although the dark-squared bishop is currently restricted, we'll see White has a specific plan to later activate this important piece. Since White is prepared to strike in the center and build an attack on the king side, Black seeks play on the queen side starting with c5, claiming more central and queenside space before activating the other knight to c6, when White strikes in the center with e4. We can see Black's dark-squared bishop appreciating the e7 square. If Black decided to activate this bishop on d6 instead, then e5 would be a threat, forking the bishop and knight. Even though e5 is not currently threatening a fork, it is a desirable idea for White, trying to split the board in half. White gains a space advantage on the king side and will focus on attacking the enemy king. A typical King's Indian attack middle game struggle develops after knight c6 and rook e1. White's rook supports advancing the e4 pawn to e5. With this in mind, Black sometimes plays queen c7, preparing to add pressure against White's pawn once it advances to e5. Moving the queen also allows Black's kingside rook to join the queenside if necessary, for example moving it to c8 once the light-squared bishop enters the game. This maneuver clears the f8 square to help defend Black's kingside with a future bishop f8, an interesting strategy worth investigating. Instead of focusing on development, Black may continue to seize queenside space with b5. When White grabs space on the king side with e5, gaining a tempo against the knight, evicting an important defender of black's kingside. The knight can retreat to d7, adding a second attacker against the e5 pawn. The e5 pawn is an annoying element to deal with as it prevents black's pieces from using the d6 and f6 squares. Trying to challenge this pawn with f6 is a risky decision, as this allows e takes f6, suddenly creating a backward pawn on e6 as a target for white's pieces. After playing e5, gaining a space advantage on the king side, white begins the second phase of preparing to maneuver pieces toward that side of the board, starting with knight f1. This clears the path for the dark-squared bishop, but it isn't immediately obvious how white intends on activating the knight on f1. e3 is the obvious choice, adding pressure against black's center, and it sometimes is used with good effect, but it may surprise you that white could have another idea in mind. As both sides prepare their play on opposite sides of the board, we don't see a direct confrontation just yet. Black continues to grab space on the queen side with a5, and white claims space on the king side with h4. The h-pawn may continue to advance up the board, possibly softening black's dark squares if allowed with h5 and h6, confronting the g7 pawn. The h-pawn is also useful on the h4 square, as it supports a possible bishop g5, trying to exchange the dark-squared bishop, a key defender of black's kingside. The h4 pawn also supports a possible knight g5, adding serious pressure against black's kingside while opening up a path for queen h5, when black's king is certainly feeling the heat on the king side. A less obvious point behind h4 is opening up the h2 square for white's knight on the first rank, preparing to enter the kingside action with knight g4, eyeing the important f6 and h6 dark squares surrounding black's king. This strategy can prove quite dangerous for black's king, although with proper play, as well as calm nerves, black should have adequate resources to hold the balance. It feels like both sides are ignoring one another after the space gaining b4. When white activates the dark-squared bishop while supporting the advanced e5 pawn with bishop f4. Bishop a6 is one option to explore, preparing to support a possible c4 pawn break. But it's also possible to follow in the footsteps of Grandmaster Wesley So by continuing to advance the queenside pawn storm with a4. We reach a critical moment in this typical King's Indian attack variation. White is focused on building a kingside initiative while black has responded in kind by preparing counterplay on the queenside. It seems as if both sides are simply ignoring one another, but now it's important to recognize the delayed clash of ideas. White is excited to build a kingside attack, but a player of Grandmaster Wesley So's caliber isn't going to simply allow such a one-sided advantage. a3 is a desirable idea for black, fixing white's structure and provoking dark-squared weaknesses on the queen side. So the former world champion Bobby Fischer demonstrated the important prophylactic measure, a3, stopping black's a-pawn in its tracks before continuing with this kingside attack. Preventing black's a-pawn from advancing allows white's c-pawn to remain flexible, so b3 would be well met by c3, keeping the queenside closed, limiting black's counterplay, which increases the effectiveness of white's kingside attacking plans. The middle game struggle is typically defined after b takes a3, b takes a3, opening up the b file, followed by bishop a6, activating the light-squared bishop while preparing counterplay down the b file with rook b8, eyeing the b2 square, as well as contemplating knight d4, adding pressure against the c2 pawn while challenging white's knight. As black prepares to generate counterplay on the queen side, white will likely advance the h-pawn up the board, trying to provoke weaknesses after h6, turning the h6 pawn into a hook that white will try to use to tear open black's kingside. Or if allowed, provoke dark-squared weaknesses after h6, attacking the g7 pawn. Knight e3 is also possible, adding pressure against the center and preparing a possible pawn thrust c4. But white may also follow the typical King's Indian attack recipe of knight 1 to h2, eyeing the g4 square, intensifying the pressure against black's kingside. The prophylactic a3 is an important line for the viewer to investigate, but Grandmaster So's opponent, the rising Polish star Grandmaster Jan Krzysztof Duda, ignored Wesley's idea and continued with the tempting, but less accurate knight 1 to h2. The knight eyes the g4 square, but black forces white to react to his idea after the strong shot a3, threatening the unprotected b2 pawn when white is forced to make a queenside concession. Capturing the pawn activates black's rook on the a file. It also weakens the c3 square, which a black knight would love to exploit. Grandmaster Duda decided to play b3, fixing the queenside structure, creating a serious hole on c3. This also invites a black knight to d4, as white can no longer challenge this knight with c3. White shouldn't be too eager to exchange knights on d4, allowing black to open up the c-file after c takes d4, an important source of queenside counterplay. In the game, Grandmaster So continued with the plan of bishop b7, clearing the path for rook c8, preparing to break open the queenside with c4. Wesley later played rook e8, and in this case allowing the knight on d7 to help support the kingside if needed with knight f8. This is one of the sharper lines of the King's Indian attack, but we can also see the positional subtlety required to play this line well. You wouldn't automatically assume securing the a3 square could be an important factor in increasing the strength of White's kingside attack, but it was precisely this point that allowed Black to gain a comfortable advantage, building dangerous counterplay on the queenside that allowed Grandmaster So to bring home the full point. That being said, if you're not a world-class grandmaster just yet, successfully defending against White's kingside pressure isn't always so easy in a practical game. So it's definitely worth your time to study model games to gain a sense of how these general ideas may play out in practice.